Welcome to the Thriving Farmer Podcast. I'm your host, Michael Kilpatrick. Our mission is to inspire, educate, and celebrate sustainable farming. We believe that you can build a profitable, sustainable farm that gives you true farm freedom. Join us as we talk to farmers, innovators, educators, and entrepreneurs to glean their top takeaways in business and life. Hey, Thriving Farmers, Michael Kilpatrick here with yet another episode of the Thriving Farmer Podcast. Today's episode is with one of my favorite farmers, Karl Hammer of Vermont Compost. Now, Karl has been making compost in Vermont for a couple decades now. And actually, in his own words, he says, we don't make soil, we participate in mystery. And I love that about Karl because their compost is hands down some of the best in the world, I believe, some of the best I've ever used to grow transplants in. And it is known nationwide as that. I mean, it ships as far as California, which he's quite upset about. He'd love to see a lot more local producers of compost in their areas. But this is a fascinating, wide-ranging conversation, a little bit scattered, but you're going to just love it because Karl shares just so much information as well as just the deep aspect of why they do what they do, how they do what they do, and what you need to be focused on in your potting mix and your soil to really make sure that your plants get off to a good start. So join me in welcoming Karl to the podcast. I wish I had had multiple more hours to discuss things with him, but we had another podcast scheduled right after, so we had to cut it at over an hour. So he said he'd be happy to come back on again, and if you guys want it, feel free to reach out and send me some questions, and if we get enough questions, we will bring him on again to do a follow-up. So there you go. Help me welcome Karl to the podcast.
Give anybody who had never heard of us a quick overview. Vermont Compost Company was founded in 1993, and in 94 and 6 we acquired the piece of land on Main Street in the capital city that we utilize for our farm, and it's a hill farm. We have gravity is a big asset. Main Street is at about 900 feet, and on 40 acres or so, we get to 1,100 feet. So we actually have some fairly gently rolling hills. Much of our farm is pretty steep, and we started collecting. We really started. We were already making compost on a dairy farm that we had contracted with to manage the manure excess to their cropping needs. Vermont, by the 90s, was starting to require nutrient management on larger farm operations, and it evolved that we became a part of the management on a dairy farm to remove phosphorus that was excess to their appropriate cropping needs. And this we see compost making as the thin brown line that connects specialized husbandry to specialized horticulture. Like a streak of poop, Captain Compost. Yeah. So because Vermont and many other places have this kind of excess nutrient thing on some of their livestock operations and insufficient nutrients on crop production and hay production and vegetable production. So we saw that was a niche we were interested in, and we understood and knew that we wanted to make potting soils for greenhouse production because that were compost based and that were alive, that would give germinating plants and early growth of plants that living soil situation. And the good news for us over time is that part of the business, the making of potting media for greenhouse growers, has good margins. We are able to get paid what we need to get paid to produce the material and get it to the customer and pay a year-round crew of dedicated soil makers. But on the way there, we were really wanted to, it started out as a question, how much of what you would usually feed chickens for grain could you stop feeding them if you started feeding them a blend of farm, forest, and community residual?
Mm-hmm.
And the answer we realized very quickly in 98 was we didn't have to buy any more grain at all, period, full stop, which was a shock. As we sort of thought about it backwards, we realized, well, all right, feeding grain to poultry, it comes about after the invention of combine harvesters. People who harvest their grain by hand don't raise it for chickens historically, or all but never. Chickens might get spoiled grain. So for most of the 10,000 years that people and this jungle fowl have fellow traveled, they were nothing was being grown for them per se. They were eating at the margin of what we can't eat and don't want to eat. And so it's only in the last 100 years or so that feeding them specifically came about. And mixed stock farms up until the Second World War, poultry can live quite well on what cattle and equines are not eating or in their feed. So it's a relatively recent practice to feed poultry in confinement and feed them grain. And in grain short world, that seems like really big news to us. And it's clear to us that the birds enhance the process. So in our case, we bring community food in, we blend it with, we have a herd of mammoth donkeys that we're raising to support the protection of an endangered livestock species. And we have that manure. We bring in other equine stable manure, and we take cattle manure and hardwood bark, and we blend those things. We make a thing called hot mix, and we then receive the food and blend that. Depending on the supply of food in terms of the need of the chickens, we like to lacto-ferment that material as it arrives. We pickle.
Okay.
That stabilizes the proteins. We then let the birds have their forage opportunity. And in Vermont, in the middle of the winter, the thermal the thermal bump of the compost process is very important to the birds.
Yes.
They're foraging on piles. They're kind of standing in little shelves they make these little terraces in the pile, and they stand it with their feet in the warm material, harvesting the food, yes, but also fungus, bacteria, many things we don't know about that they are harvesting out of that process. And they are incorporating their own very valuable excreta into the process as they do it. We then take that material from having proffered it to the poultry and start the thermophilic high temperature part of our compost process, which very rapidly eliminates the things that the poultry are interested in. So pretty quickly, once we achieve composting temperatures with that material, the birds are less interested progressively in it as we roll it away from them. And we on our farm use very standard tools. We don't have any dedicated compost turning equipment. We use front end loaders, and 20 years ago we learned how to turn the bucket around on a hydraulic excavator so that it's front shoveling.
Okay, yeah.
And that's one of the key turning tools on the farm.
Interesting.
The track machine eliminates the need for traction, which a loader requires. So, and fundamentally, our process is about stacking and restacking as gently as possible, because we're not necessarily trying to. We like to rot things. We don't own any shredders or any of those sort of violent tools. We like gentle tools. And the benefit too is that fully evolved industrial tool, a front end loader or a hydraulic excavator, is manufactured by many vendors. Competition, they have value by the pound. They can be readily bought and sold. Whereas dedicated compost machinery, once you bought it, you kind of own it.
You're stuck.
It can be sold perhaps, but to a very limited market. And frankly, if you do that, I always somewhere along the line learned to do a discipline when I'm shopping for machinery, which is to take the price and divide it by the weight.
Oh.
Bearings and steel cost everybody about the same. There are economies of scale, there are advantages and so on. But I always want to know, what is this costing me per pound? And if you take any kind of specialized ag equipment, typically, it's very expensive.
Yeah.
Way to buy steel and bearings. It really is. And anyway, that has served us, I think, fairly well. Though, the salesman for dedicated machine will sometimes come along and say, well, if you're a real composter, you'd have a compost turner. But some compost turners are actually destructive. They have their place, perhaps, but they can excessively macerate the material. And since a lot of the process goal is to have the material move air by convection, if you overwork it and over macerate it, you can hinder the process.
Gotcha. So you're saying the larger material really helps get that air throughout the pile.
Yeah, well, and sometimes material's too large and needs to get smaller. So wood chips are a thing that we utilize, and we understand what the benefit is. We don't have a chipper. I'd rather rot wood before I try to particle size reduce it.
Yeah.
Because that occupies time, but not a lot of effort or expense or fuel. So it's much easier to chip rotten wood than fresh wood. From a business perspective, we have always tried to not own the high horsepower tools. We try to keep our equipment low horsepower.
How far away is material coming to your operation?
Well, community food has come to us from a region that extends out probably about 30 or 40 miles at the greatest extent. Our farm manures are much closer, less than 10 miles typically, maybe as much as 15. We do a lot of Vermont's hardwood goes across the border into Canada to be made into lumber, because the Canadians have invested much more. Vermont mills are a declining species, and the Canadians have kept up with their technology, bandsaws and so on. So we import hardwood bark from Canadian mills across the border. Most of the logs are actually Vermont logs, but
interesting.
They go to Canada for processing, and we bring bark back. And we've used hardwood bark for over 30 years. It's a very magical material. Bark is the clothing a tree wears to face the world. It's very bioactive and has all kinds of enzymic benefit that we know supports plant growth. So we've been using bark for a very long time. It sweetens the process. We use it as bedding under our equines and our poultry, and we incorporate it in process. So that pretty much that's coming almost 100 miles to us, that bark. If I left anything out, we do utilize a carbon black, what some people might call biochar. That's the top ash from a old technology wood-fired power plant that leaves that. So that material is about 68% elemental carbon.
Okay.
And it's a waste product of those mills. So we get it at a very attractive price. And we include that charcoal in our process from the very beginning of everything gets a little bit. If I left anything out, we add some other things as condiment. Because we have a steep site and need traction, about 10 years ago, we developed a traction mix that is 80% wood chip and 20% manufactured granite sand, basalt, and calcium carbonate, limestone. So we put those three stones it's 20% by volume and 80% wood chip. The wood chip prevents this mix from freezing, so we can use it all winter, and we can keep small piles around the whole of the farm. And we distribute that material through a loader-mounted trommel screen, so that it goes on at a perfect layer, because it's tire hop that makes a truck tire spin. When a tire's in the air, it isn't tractioning. So if we're going to run 100,000-pound live bottom trucks up an 8% grade, we don't want their tires hopping. So how we apply, and this traction mix, because it's running, it goes on, it's about 100 degrees coming out of the pile. It's kind of melts itself into any ice events, and so it's very effective for traction. Then, as the snow starts to melt, or it starts to rain, is very common anymore in our world. It rains on snow. This material dissipates the energy of the water coming down. It forms into flow forms and works its way down the hill. And we have all of our water generally going into catchments that are intended to be filtered. So the traction mix becomes water filter in its second use, as it washes off and gets pushed off. And we lay it on pretty thick. We actually use it to manage, we lay up as the frost and ice and snow, our road surfaces, we maintain the crown with this material, so we keep the water off the road. And then as the spring progresses, we pick this material up and we pile it and work it, and we refer to it lovingly as road slop. But we ultimately utilize it in parts of the farm that are shallow to bedrock, where our ambition is to achieve what the pre-Inca Aymara people achieved in the Andes in Peru and Ollantaytambo and places like that, where they literally constructed a 12-foot soil lay.
Wow.
So we have places on the farm where we've added 6 feet over bedrock of this very lively. Remember that wood. One of the big components of a wood chip is silica. So the combination of wood chip, spilled compost, and this traction mix becomes a matrix for increasing the volume of the farm's productive soils, all of which, in the 100-year frame is intended to optimize the photosynthetic potential.
Absolutely. So from when the material first hits your farm to when it usually leaves as like a potting soil mix, how long does that generally happen?
Oh, and I should say, I sometimes think of the whole process as if it were a clockwork. So different wheels are moving at different speeds. Some things go through process faster than others. And in general, composts are something like 8 months old at the minimum before they're utilized in a potting soil or mixed media. I should say we never adding wood chip directly into the product that is going to become potting soil, because wood chip is too non-specific a noun for us, unlike, say, maple bark. And so all of the wood chip componentry stays on the farm longer. We did an analysis, a macro analysis of 20 years of invoice, a quick one, to just get a mass balance about how much of the weight of material we brought onto the farm in 20 years has left the farm as sold product, and how much is still on the farm. And I can say that we basically ship the light fantastic. Our sorting keeps all the heaviers close to home. So Potting soil is the lightest product and has the furthest reach. Embarrassingly enough, it sometimes gets to the West Coast, Oregon, California, gets to the middles, Colorado, Wisconsin. The heavier compost and soil blend products that weigh more tend to land closer in Vermont, in New York, in Maine, and New Hampshire. And the heaviest component, the road slop, the screening overs, and so on, is being incorporated into the farm itself. Recently, this question came up about whether more than 51% of the weight of product has stayed on the farm over the last 20 years, because that's a statutory and regulatory thing about whether the material is principally utilized on the farm. And we're now able to prove that more than 51% of the weight of material processed is still on the farm, accumulating as deeper soil. I don't know if that exactly answered your question, but from the time a fresh cow poop comes or a bagel comes on the farm, it's about 8 months to a year before it is put into a mix like Fort V, say.
Absolutely. All right, so let's talk about Fort V, because that's kind of, I think, you're probably, I'd say, your flagship product. What sets that apart from, let's just say, someone producing compost? Because I think that's a misunderstanding.
Yeah, well, so the word compost comes from a Latin root to mix things. So composting is intentional blending of stuff. And in England, Fort V would be called a potting compost.
Okay.
Which reflects their closer relations to Latin. And we tried calling it potting compost in the 90s, and nobody knew what we were talking about, so we gave up. But we make a manure-based compost. We call it manure compost, though it also has all these other ingredients we've talked about. And at a certain point, we have that material. We call it compost. We sell it as compost. Its bulk density is high for potting media. Its nutrient profile is well, its pH is really high. It's higher in certain components than are ideal for germination and early seed production. It is a concentrate. So a material like Fort V, and we could take it a little step back, and how did that name come about? Once upon a time, we had a half step. We blended compost with peat and a couple of other ingredients, and we didn't intend it to be a fully complete potting media. We sold it that way, and a lot of growers had trouble with it because they didn't amend it adequately to get good early growth. So then we started making a thing which was fortified. That's where Fort came from. And V, which we now spell VEE, distinguished a potting soil made with vermiculite as a light aggregate from what we then called Fort P, which had perlite as a light aggregate, because growers had different preferences about the way water attacks those materials. So Fort P ultimately became Fort Light, and Fort V got 2 E's because people would call up and say, want to buy some of that Fort 5, and you have to begin the sentence by saying, well, actually, that's V. So now Fort V, it's one of those names like Coca-Cola. It turns out to be a really trademarkable name because it doesn't have any common words, whereas, say, Compost Plus, which is a product we make and sell, is unprotectable because it's made out of common words. That's very hard to protect. So Fort V it is, and Fort V is was really developed as a blocking mix, and the objection to perlite was twofold. One, it tended to not hold up corners on a block as well as the vermiculite. And some of us don't like looking at perlite because it reminds us of styrofoam. Perlite is not styrofoam. It's a volcanic glass related to obsidian that's expanded by fire, and it has a huge internal geometry that's very beneficial for microbial exchange, and it both holds and water while improving drainage. So but it still looks like styrofoam.
Mhm.
So, and we've made those two products for years because growers have strong personal preferences. I sometimes think of what we do as having it's a three-legged stool. There's the plant material and its genetics and capabilities. There's the media, and there's the hand of the grower. And those are the three legs of any plant production. And each of them is very adaptable and very variable. I mean, the plants want to grow, and they will overcome deficiencies of media and hand of grower to some degree. But our goal in making media is to really give the plant the optimum opportunity to get growing and support different growers who are going to subject those plants and media to very different environments.
Because that's a question that comes up. Some people are saying, well, I should use a soilless mix, or, just peat and vermiculite or perlite and then some fertilizer, and they don't want compost in their mix. But what I'm hearing you say is compost allows you it's a lot easier of a product to grow a plant in.
Well, not easier, but I will say that we do a lot of trialing, and when we trial media with no living component, that we always do better than and there are we wish to support. We don't make soil, we participate in mystery. And there is mystery, there's science, and there's craft, and we put a lot of effort into trying to replicate and be reliable, because our customers are in business and this is really critical for them. Potting soil is typically a relatively small component in the whole cost of a plant grow. Plant material itself can be more expensive, fancy than the media you put it in. Fancy pepper seeds are 60 cents a piece. We're encountering feminized cannabis cultivars that are $3 and $4 a seed. So we're going into 12 cents worth of media. Heat, labor, overhead are all more expensive components. So really, if the media fails, everything else is sunk cost. You shouldn't have even heated the greenhouse, say nothing of committed the seed. So it is critically important that the media support the overall intention of the grower and the process. And we like to think that we help our growers be profitable. That is our goal. We're really worried when a grower has a system that is unprofitable.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. So one of the things I hear people talking about is the nutrient levels in like a compost-based mix and salts. And that salts can cause, germination issues, but with a compost-based mix, that keeps those salt levels down, correct?
Well, it depends. That's very specific to the compost.
Okay.
Composts can be very high, and we're constantly. I have a lab and a full-time 1.5 people in it. We're planting plants constantly. Every batch is trialed on benches under lights to control, photo period and the situation we grow out in the field as well. And one of our constant monitorings is the electrical conductivity of mix. And the salts, as they're called, can be several. There are several salt ions. Nitrate is a salt, sodium is a salt, potassium is a salt. So just knowing merely the salt content doesn't tell you which salts they are necessarily. So we also do some ion-specific monitoring, and we have standards above which we will not go. But we've always taken the point of view that we should ask the plant, that the plant is the client, and the farmer is the person in the middle writing the check or not. But so I would much rather see questionable labs and excellent plants than troubled plants and excellent labs. And I've seen it both ways. So to that end, we are growing at any given moment typically a dozen, but sometimes 20 different types of plants to really, and then those plants we actually cut and weigh photograph. All of this is to try to make sure that when the grower gets the product, it's going to do the job for them.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And, all of that is supported by what the grower pays for the material.
Mm-hmm.
And a lot of we have enjoyed over many years, tremendous loyalty from growers. I'm making potting soils for people that have been buying it for 30 years now.
Wow.
And we like to think that, really, sharp grower is always looking to improve things, but mostly not necessarily shopping for potting soil, because just buying less expensive potting soil is probably not good management. Way better off to do a labor improvement or a heat, a thermal improvement that reduces your cost there, and stay with potting soil that works for you.
Mm-hmm.
And really, we re-upping. We've got people that have been buying. Well, we're finally into the third generation of customer.
Wow. So pests and compost, I hear people ask about that. They talk about soldier flies or mites or ants. How should people be dealing with those in their compost piles?
Well, pests and compost. First of all, we really adhere to a thermophilic regime in compost making.
Okay.
And part of that is regulatory. Many of our growers are certified organic, and the National Organic Program stipulates what may be called compost, and that requires a time and temperature regime, which we adhere. We actually believe that temperature regime is higher than is optimal. Mm-hmm. It's 131 degrees Fahrenheit, which came from the 1978 Part 503 EPA temperature regime for biosolids or sludge, and it was addressed at the then understanding about salmonella mortality in these materials. Many decades of good research since have clarified that salmonella is much more vulnerable at higher moistures than it is at low moisture. Mm-hmm. So salmonella can tolerate pretty high temperatures if the matrix is below, say, 40% moisture. But optimum composting at 50% moisture has very high salmonella mortality at about 122 Fahrenheit, especially if you do 7-day residence instead of the required 3-day residence in the NOP and the Part 503. And this points at some interesting things about rules. Very hard to change a federal rule. Mm-hmm. You need, it's not common to walk into a bar and have people glued to a television show about the rule on compost temperatures and arguing back and forth about that it should be changed. So basically not going to change the rule. And if we're going to say we did something, we like it to be true. Mm-hmm. So we're but we really believe that above about 140 Fahrenheit, we start to have significant mortality of beneficial components like mycorrhizal spores. So we live in that small window between 132 and 140, and we achieve it. But one of the benefits of that high temperature process for a minimum of 15 days, but we really run those thermophilic temperatures typically for more like 60 days, mm-hmm. 50 to 60 days. We eliminate anything that depends on larvae, grubs, eggs. We eliminate insects and most pathogens that mm-hmm. are of concern, including plant pathogens. Now, in the curing phase, we expose ourselves to an ecology, the world, at lower temperatures. And our belief is that engagement with the surrounding field and forest ecologies and increasing diversity wherever possible protects the process. I think for human health, my personal health, total microbial immersion is my, how I'm going with it. And it seems to be working for us pretty well in terms of the productivity of the soil. And it's not that we want to get rid of every pest, it's we want them in manageable balance. Mm-hmm. And once again, ask the plants. So, and I will say something about compost or any media. It's not abstract. It's actual stuff. And there are no two identical piles. Mm-hmm. So everything is on some spectrum of acceptable or unacceptable. And from a practical and business point of view, that's why the trialing is so important. We've had the world offers many threats. So a number of years ago came the threat of persistent herbicides, the pyrene family of herbicides. And many composters sold material that damaged particularly plants like nightshades, tomatoes, and that was really catastrophic for the growers involved. We avoided that both by luck and process, but we were taking many of the materials that neighboring composters were using, and one thing that we had going for us is that we started the process of what is now called bioassay, which is to say planting a broad range of plants in the material. We've been doing that for over 20 years to protect ourselves from the really painful event of selling a potting soil to a grower that causes them trouble.
Exactly. Yeah. So, I mean, did you see that in some of the batches that you built, the herbicide?
We first of all, this would be a very long diversion to really get into talking about persistent pyrenes and their several manifestations. We think we saw some in some younger horse manure blends that we were working with. One of the things that emerged at the end of the whole persistent pyrene thing is that process probably matters, because each of the 4 pyrenes that were of concern have very different breakdown paths. Some of and unless you want to get deep into this, I think maybe we don't want to, but some of the aminoclopyrrolate is water soluble, and some of the composters who were having the trouble were refluxing their leachates as part of their regulatory schema. We think that kept reinvigorating the potential of these materials. And bear in mind, these persistent pyrenes are not toxic to animals as far as anyone can tell. The developers of these materials, Dow and DuPont and so on, and I spent 2 years in conference calls with EPA and our Department of Ag and Dow chemists, and trying to get to the bottom of how this works. I became aware that the people who developed these materials were very proud of them, because they are they mimic the plant auxins that are herbicidal. They are much safer for the people, animals, and the environment than 2,4-D and other herbicides like that. Some plants are completely tolerant to them, beets, oats, and frankly, anybody eats a oatmeal molasses cookie is getting fat, many parts per million of persistent herbicide. But these are not animal toxins. So back to the first point is, the problem with them is that they kill plants. So we, by broadly assaying the material, and many things can cause. The first symptom of these pyrenes is what's called epinasty, when a plant kind of gets blisters and twists. So our strategy included planting highly susceptible plants like red clover or beans, and planting resistant plants like oats. Because just because you're seeing plant response or even epinasty doesn't mean it's from pyrenes. It could be from uncomposted fatty lipids. Fatty acids can cause very similar symptoms. But if you're seeing the oats suffering the symptom, it's not a pyrene. It's something else. So back to the practical lesson, and any grower, one of my hobby horses was, when you have a crop that's really important to mortgage lifter, whatever it is, you should trial it before your main plantings. You should make sure that the seed is working, that the media is working. I used to carry seeds in a plastic bag in a paper towel. In one plastic bag, straight seed in a paper towel, other plastic seed in potting soil, and see how the germ count is. Make sure my compost or my soil is not suppressive. And that's just self-defense. Before,
Yeah.
don't commit all your mortgage lifting seed on one day to media, never having planted any of it. Leap ahead on your windowsill. When you get your seed and you get your potting soil, put it together and make sure that it's working.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Absolutely. So, I think one of the big questions people have is, why are there not other operations like yours popping up around the country? Because I know you don't like seeing your product on the West Coast.
Well, first of all, in many places, people are trying to do what we do. It's attractive for a lot. People look at, I'm going to have a compost business. Where can I make a living at this?
Mm-hmm.
Commodity compost, you're constantly competing with municipal products that may or may not be very excellent, but they certainly can advertise lower prices. And the reason we have market in distant places is not that nobody in those places has a product that they would like to sell in place of our product. It's that by trial, those products frequently don't deliver full performance.
Mm-hmm.
So frankly, 27 or 8 years after incorporating Vermont Compost, we're starting to think, what do the next 20 some odd years look like? And as a soil citizen, I hope that every region will have competence at this very important craft. And the question about what role we might play in helping that occur is kind of current business development thinking of ours. One of the things I know is that having this is my third compost business I've been involved in. In each of the businesses that I was involved in establishing prior to this one, when I left, the performance of the product dropped.
Mm-hmm.
Now, that's not about me having some
magical
I don't think
powers.
This is me having a magical connection to the microbial ecology that does this work. It's about really demanding having very high standards about ingredients and process, and verifying that with performance. So we are in the process of trying to codify what we know, because we know some things, and we know there are probably some other things that we don't know, because I've always been very intuitive about how to lay out process. I think intuition leaps over science frequently. It just gets you there faster, and then you use science to fill in why it might be helping, whatever the intuition was. But now we have a lab, we have people whose job it is to try to codify process. We're putting a lot of effort into understanding how we respond to changes of material coming at you, because the material flow will always be changing. That's the nature of materials. And as I said before, compost is not an abstraction. It's actual stuff you have to manage. And cautionary to everybody, this is stuff that's shrinking.
Yeah.
Okay. So I've seen compost business plans that didn't have shrink in them.
Oh no.
Yeah. Oh no. Okay. So we have a big rule of thumb about shrink, and then we measure too. And it confirms our rule of thumb. Rule of thumb's always been conservative. We say it takes 2.5 yards average of stuff to have a yard of something to sell.
Mm-hmm.
And you better keep that firmly in your mind as you're supplying yourself. So, and we've enjoyed robust business growth over the last many years, generally speaking, over the whole time we've been making the products. And that presents its own problems, because we can't just hit send. Mm-hmm. We're a media company, but we actually make the media. So part of the joke is that we're a media company with the aspiration to get profit from hitting send.
Yes.
And that means having the experience of setting up. When I left a particular place, I was making potting soil in another state in another time, but close enough for us to have directly competed with that business, which still operates ever since. Within 2 years, the product was unreliable. It had weed seed. We were able to effectively have people drive right by that place and drive right back by with our higher priced product. Okay. And what that said to me was, ongoing tuition and control is a thing here. And it's very easy to fall off the track. Many projects, and it's important from the grower who's buying this product that, okay, you buy the product, it works great. You buy the product again, whoops, it doesn't work at all. That's really challenging.
Yeah. It's better to have a product that's poor performing consistently than to have it one time work great, one time not.
Well, and weeding your seedlings, that's the lowest part of the bar, okay?
Yes.
That is not okay. The labor involved in weeding seedlings, and this is a reason that, a lot of growers think, well, why don't I make my own potting soil? And I would certainly encourage any grower with a passion for it to do exactly that. I think bottom of the list of reasons for a grower to make their own potting soil probably is not to save money, because it probably won't save them money if they make a reliable potting soil. They will have to put a lot of attention to it, and they will have to buy ingredients that are costly, and they will have trouble buying them as well as we do, for instance, because we buy trailer loads of things, and if you're only buying a little of it, you will pay more. So, but you would make your, and I would encourage anybody who's, well, famously, many people that our customers, when we met them, they said, well, we make our own, and we're using Elliott Coleman's mix, which was for years pretty funny, because Elliott Coleman's been buying potting soil from us since the 90s, because he says, well, I get on the phone, it comes quickly, and it's cheaper than I can make it myself, and it's reliable, and I've got somebody to yell at if I'm having trouble, all of which are benefits, because look in the mirror and yell at yourself. There are plenty of opportunities for that in most of our farms, and who needs another one? So that's Elliott's sense of humor, but the bottom line is, it probably it makes good business sense for many businesses. Now, regionally, and what does this mean for our business going out another 20 years? We are trying to figure out how we would articulate the guidance to have because there's piles of poop and land and people and need in every region. And so shipping, as we do, because many growers cannot reliably buy the performance that they need in their bioregion. And we look forward to somehow figuring out how to exert enough control at distance to help other people achieve reliability. And we don't know how we're going to do that yet. Sometimes people throw around the word franchise, which is a legal term of art you got to be careful about.
Yeah.
But we're really talking about a tuition and control thing, and consistency. And a lot of it, my grandfather, who was in retail, always said, you make your money when you buy, not when you sell. And you make your compost when you choose the ingredients. And you can't, composter is a gatekeeper to the soil, and you have to be careful, because there's a lot of things that would like to find a place to go that you don't want on your farm or on anybody else's. And that's been one of the big, supply side is a very important part of this. How to ask the right questions, organize the logistics, and get the right materials. And then everything matters. Every day is different. Every pile is somewhat different. So what are the acceptable parameters? And back to the verify, which plants are quite willing to do for us. So maybe we're unneeded. We like to think, and it's very hard for a business to imagine not being necessary. That's one of the big problems that ExxonMobil is having about it. Unlike, say, BP, that at least theoretically sees itself as an energy company, ExxonMobil sees themselves as a petroleum company. And the handwriting is on the wall, and they're not doing a good job. So we're a potting soil company, but with rising trucking costs and an understanding that this capability should be more diffuse and broadly distributed. We're investing in the farm for the future, hoping and expecting that there will be work for us, perhaps harvesting photosynthesis in the post-industrial period.
Mm-hmm.
And, I'm 68. And so when I talk about the 20 and 40-year frame, I really am talking about transition beyond my time in this enterprise. But Vermont Compost is now paying the mortgages and feeding the children of 20 full-time employees.
Oh, wow. That is incredible.
Special thanks to our podcast sponsor, Localline, for supporting the Thriving Farmer podcast. Localline is an easy-to-use e-commerce platform for farmers to build a website, sell online, and save time in order tracking and delivery. When we tried to sell online with our farm, it was so hard. And we even had a week where a mistyped email was sending orders out into cyberspace and resulted in very frustrated customers and a very late night for me in the wash and pack shed. With Localline, everyone is happy. Easy ordering interface for the customer. Robust backend that has all the features I always wanted in a farmer-oriented e-commerce platform, such as charge when the product ships, no tracking refunds on scraps of paper, easy ordering deadlines, and drop location integration, and so much more. I was really blown away when I went through the platform. This week, they're offering Thriving Farmer podcast listeners a free premium feature valued at $300. Two of my favorite premium features are Advanced Inventory. With Advanced Inventory, this allows you to get really specific about the products you're offering and create multiple packaging and pricing options. The other premium feature I love is their QuickBooks integration. The dreaded tax season is rapidly approaching. With a Localline QuickBooks integration, you can rest assured that everything is in one place and you don't need to drown in loose leaf paperwork and sticky notes when you go to file. Plus, no one loves entering information twice. I love the once and done aspect of this one. To learn more and claim your free premium feature, you need to register at growingfarmers.localline.us. Even if you're not ready today, by registering at growingfarmers.localline.us, you can always come back and claim this offer, plus grab their free website designer today.
We are supporting the growing of over 900 commercial, mostly organic, mostly greenhouse customers.
Wow. So talk to me about when you got started. Who were your mentors? How did you learn? It's a compost science. It's a compost artistry. I think you would probably agree with me on that.
Yeah, I would. Well, mentors, I did some reading. And I will say, coming from a dairy influenced place, when people first started taking their manure and running it through a manure spreader and then rolling it around and getting it hot, I thought, wow, these are people with a lot of time on their hands. And the manure that I first utilized in my vegetable production, I should say, I come from being generous, an 8-cow hill farm in Vershire, Vermont, at the top of the watershed. Jealous of all the 30-cow farms that were around me and had fields and
yeah.
And rapidly became aware that there was no way I was gonna. Well, I wouldn't have even been able to ship milk. We didn't even have electricity, and I was on a shallow to bedrock hill farm. So, genius that I was, I decided vegetables were the opportunity. Which, on the tertiary tillage I was on, real vegetable growers, if none were visible to me really, because it was dairy farming and vegetable as for the house around me, totally. We're talking early 70s. And we did start growing vegetables, and I quickly developed the strategy of, I was surrounded on both sides of my hill by older dairy farmers who were having trouble managing the manure they were producing. And I did a lot of my first implement was a ground-driven 95 bushel New Idea manure spreader that I bought from my neighbor Stanley for $50, which was a subsidized deal. He was encouraging a teenager to do the spreader had to be worth $300-400 at the time.
Yeah.
And then I bought an insurance wreck, a 1966 Toyota Land Cruiser station wagon, long wheelbase, which was a little bit lower geared than the short wheelbase. And I bought a set of torches. That was my first big equipment buy on the farm, was a set of, besides the manure spreader, was an oxyacetylene torch.
Okay. And
I cut all the wreckage off this doodlebug, as it was called. That was in Vermont statute. A farm tractor could be a doodlebug. And doodlebug or tractor was defined by use. So having cut everything off this and welding up a hitch and welding up some support for the seat, I had a thing that was really quite the road tractor. It would go for easily 60 miles an hour if you wanted to, and it had brakes, and I pulled this ground-driven manure spreader with it, and I made a deal with neighbors on each side of the hill that I would spread a load of their manure for them and take a load home.
Uh-huh.
And all of these farmers bedded on a mix of hay that wasn't suitable for eating, so they'd put it in front of the cows, and if the cows didn't eat it, they'd put it in the gutter, or they had some hay that they didn't even put in front of the cows. And we had a chair stock mill nearby in Post Mills, and that sawed hardwood, and farmers typically went and bought hardwood sawdust. So it was a blend of spoiled hay, late cut hay, and cow manure and hardwood sawdust. And typically it was wheeled out of the barn with a wheelbarrow and up a set of planks on a pile that was really a lacto-fermentative pickle because of all the grass in it. It dropped the pH because the manure had a tendency for the pH to rise, which volatilizes the protein as ammonia. And if by adding the grass, that stabilized the protein in the matrix, also, by the way, sweetening and reducing the odor generation. So by packing these grass manure packs, by walking up them with planks and wheelbarrow, it was in the spring when you attacked that pile and loaded it in the manure spreader, literally to go the mile and a half or so from the neighbors to home, I would load a green material out of this lactofermentate, and by the time I was spreading it, it had changed color to dark brown. And so we were doing a very excellent management of that resource. It was a form of compost making. And subsequently, I became aware that there were likely, in terms of vegetable growing, some benefits to taking it another step. One of them was to really deal with weed seed, which was, I became aware very quickly as an organic vegetable grower that I did not want to be spreading grass seed with my fertility. And so I developed, I evolved and had a tractor with a PTO and got a PTO spreader. I did start utilizing that. We did utilize PTO spreaders to stack the material. And that's a fairly expensive operation. Sometimes in the early days would put the material through the spreader more than once. And over time, I learned that actually a front end loader was a more effective way to manage compost making and could impart all the benefits of manure spreading. A manure spreader, though, frankly, our potting soil business, we started manufacturing potting soil by mixing it on a pad and running it through a John Deere 40 manure spreader, the kind that had the drum, not paddles, the drum with the, it looked like a barber pole turning. And that was not very OSHA acceptable because the one person stood with the brim pulled down on a hat to avoid taking anything in the face with a rake in the pile as it came off the spreader and raking it down, and then you'd go in and harvest it above the round rollies. And that's where Fort V started, was with a 2-cylinder John Deere tractor running a manure spreader and putting it in with a Gale skid steer. Over time, we evolved to more OSHA acceptable strategy of trommel screening. We still do very simple. We don't have a dedicated mixer of any kind. We depend on the operator's talent and observation to make sure we're getting what needs to happen done. And we have a series of steps to assure that true mixing happens, because first of all, we're making a heterogeneous mix. It will in some degree, every cell in a plant tray has a slightly different mix in it. That's why we don't encourage getting smaller than 128 cells, because you get to the pixelation. We no longer have the resolution At 300 cell, you're not getting it. You're getting a lot of variation between cells because of the sizing of the media. And a lot of times a grower who wants to go with smaller cells says, gee, we wish you'd screen smaller. But we think that compromises the mix.
If there was a magic reset button as it relates to, let's say, starting over, starting your operation again, what systems would you go back and put in place sooner?
That's a very good question. I really feel pretty good about our process in terms of its protection of the water and soil resources of the farm where it's executed. I really feel good about the way we manage material. If I had it to do over again, and I would hope that I could have had a smoother regulatory path, because some of our most business existential and business threatening events have had to do with rules. And I could fault myself for not being smoother and smarter than I am. I'm not sure, looking back, if it's fair to beat myself up about that stuff. Our society has deep in it squeamishness about addressing the issues, talking about rotting and dying and recycling loses a bunch of people quickly. Alfred Hitchcock did us a tremendous disservice by making a horror movie about birds. Some people can't stand seeing seagulls or crows.
Wow.
And because I'm spending a lot of time, I live in the capital city, and the Capitol Dome is, I could fling a donkey turd and hit the Golden Dome. My jackass can be heard at the State House. So I go down there now to the people's house and talk about these issues a lot with the fellow citizens who are charged with making policy for the state and directing its regulatory agencies. And one of the things I've been talking about lately, as we talk about managing the process as solid waste versus managing it as agriculture, is that in the solid waste rule, there's a lot of loose verbiage that enables the regulatory to rule about vectors, which might include, say, crows or seagulls or ravens. And part of what a dozen or 18 years ago, when this question first came up about whether we should be allowed to share the food with crows, say, I was cautioned by attorneys and my employee that when I talk about my right to solicit crow manure for my process, because we understand ourselves to be multi-manurialists. One of our process developments is that we want to be sure that we have at least multi-gastric ruminants, the cattle or goats and so on, monogastric vegetable eaters like equines, avians, chickens. We welcome the participation of turkeys, crows, ravens, swallows, eagles, red tails, all of whom visit and partake at our midden, Old English word about a place you throw things to recycle them. And lately I've been spouting an FAO statistic, a Food and Agriculture Organization statistic, which goes something like this. Homo sapiens, humans, are 38% of land vertebrate biomass at this moment, 2020. 38% of land vertebrate biomass is humans. If you add human domestic animals, fowl, cattle, goats, and swine, it aggregates to 94 or 5% of land vertebrate biomass. We are losing birds at catastrophic insects, well, too, but I was only talking about vertebrates. That number is vertebrates. 94% of land vertebrate biomass are humans and their domestic animals. We need to share. We are pushing all these other vertebrates out. And so when we see a crow land and pick up a piece of suet, and crows, being aviators, always unload before they take off with a load. So I can depend on them contributing their fecal bolus, which is a unique biology. Each organism and type of organism, a crow, a raven, and by the way, eagles' feeding habits are fascinating. Who knew eagles will take apples from a pile? And I don't know what an eagle does with an apple when he flies away with it, whether it's a present for someone else, because or whether this particular eagle has a passion for apples. Anyway, that's a side note. But we participate in a very intense avian and other vertebrate ecology. The coyotes have access to the midden. We don't like them in the chicken house, and we have a good working relationship in that regard. Foxes. So I am now, because the solid waste rules can prohibit this, we really want, when a turkey comes in from the woods and comes to our cafeteria and poops there, it's bringing forest biota into my pile, allowing my birds access to field and forest, because all these birds are always eating the soil where they forage, are bringing back beneficial biota to the pile, including mycorrhizal potential, which you cannot generate in compost process. You can only diminish it. Because mycorrhizal spores mycorrhizae are host obligate. You have to have photosynthesizing plants for them to life cycle. So we operate our process with the hope and expectation that we will have broad range of mycorrhizal opportunity in the media. And that's part of the reason that we try to travel that narrow temperature band between legal and meeting our obligation of truth telling that we achieve these temperatures, and damaging to those beneficials. We're always looking for opportunities to bring that neighboring ecology into our process. As a compost process evolves, and many compost processes evolve to be on concrete slabs, in vessels, all these things that steadily diminish the opportunity for beneficial biota to come in from the surrounding ecology. And we deeply believe in that diversity. And we actually, one of our strategies is to grow known beneficial plants on media and then incorporate that media into process. We call that glomalin grow, and we have substantial amounts of it. We need to then make sure that we've managed the weed potential for the weed seeds. We think of Fort V, if I were going to be the the Merriam-Webster of biology of process, and I would be the czar, and I would say soil is defined as material that has had a succession of plants. And what we are providing is a latent soil, free of, and the grower gets to choose the genetics of the first order of plant succession. That's a very uncommon event in nature, a latent soil like that. Volcanoes can do it, and we do it. A soil that has not had a plant succession. Which is the production need of a 2020 greenhouse grower.
Absolutely.
And we've done a bunch of work with microgreens people over the last number of years to talk about reutilizing the material, to think about a microgreens tray as a part of the farm, a tillage base, not a consumable. Because microgreens growers in specific have the opportunity to rotate through a broad range of plant families. And somebody would say, well, there are a lot of people who caution, well, no, I dump the mix every time because I don't want trouble. But frankly, if you're growing pea shoots, you have put a huge investment of pea material in that tray. And you grow 2 sets of shoots and they start to get tough. Well, it's flip it over and grow some mustard, or drizzle some, because you got to kill the peas or they'll come up in the mustard. So that's the technical issue about how do you reutilize that huge fertility opportunity represented by the pea material, and ditto plants like sunflowers. So, and from a business point of view for us, I'd love to sell you a drizzle of Fort V that you utilize over time. And one of the benefits is that microgreens production benefits from a larger volume of soil, because the root to shoot plants growing in their best photosynthetic opportunity typically have higher root volume than plant volume. Trees do if they have the opportunity. Most plants have more biomass subterranean than above ground, and that's the buffer for health. So when you try to run too little media, you add stress. So if you can reutilize the media almost indefinitely, you can run more media, and that gives you huge benefit in production like microgreens.
Yeah, we got a couple clients who are flipping it like 6 to 8 to 10 times.
Right, and perhaps drizzling in some material to get the seed bed and so on. And then, it becomes, and at the end, I had one grower who looking very perplexed as I'm doing a workshop on this, and he came up to me after, he said, well, the problem for me is that's how we produce eggs, is we do that cutting of the microgreen, and that's how we're feeding our chickens, and that's what they're living on, is those harvested media.
Yeah.
I said, yeah, well, okay, if that's the solvency for your system, fine. And though you could probably feed it, you could probably get a couple uses before you feed it.
Yeah.
And that root mass is a huge amount of material. It's exciting when you start doing red, look at beet roots that are bright red. Basil roots smell like basil. The root mass is a significant part of what you're producing, and it's utilizable for ongoing production. Because the sun drives all of this. It's all about photosynthesis. I sometimes like to characterize compost as the catalyst for the second stage photosynthetic drawdown, the root exudates. Because sometimes people talk about the carbon you're putting in soil with compost, and that's relevant and worth calculating, but that's not the key value of compost making. If it was, you would put the compost right in the ground without making compost, because you always combust some carbon and make some CO2 in your compost making. And that is one of the calculations we try to do in managing a process, is to have it have the highest mass balance yield, keep as much carbon in the matrix as possible, consistent with achieving the other goals that have us manipulating the material in the first place.
Absolutely.
And try to remind ourselves that it's the sun that drives the whole thing.
Yeah, it is. Let's shift gears a little bit and talk about, you're in Vermont. There's a lot of new farmers popping into Vermont and popping up all around the U.S. and around the world. What do you see some of the biggest mistakes that they're making are?
Well, they wear themselves out and hurt themselves is one of the long-range concerns. By their determination is so powerful, their yearning to get it done and be doing it can be hurting them. So, and what are the components of that could be mitigated with craft and support? So the next thing I would say really broadly is that they are trying to farm with inadequate fertility and unbalanced fertility. It used to be completely understood by the Renaissance that the limit of your the productive acreage that you could farm was how much fertility you could bring to bear. And it's much more profitable to farm less land and have it yield well than to spread out and have travel over a lot of land and have it yield poorly. So one piece of sort of provocative advice I have made in podcast context is, if I were addressing a bunch of young vegetable growers, wannabe vegetable or produce growers, I would recommend that they start with poultry. Because that's the fountainhead of the fertility. And the other thing that is one of those useless pieces of good advice is get the right farm. Don't. Some places are going to be too hard to try, and some of them are going to be easiest to buy. The too hard to try
because no one else wants it.
Yeah, or it's too. If you're going to sell food to people, being far away from people is a problem. It could be surmounted. You get great land far away where nobody will bother you and wholesale it. But out in the, I come from far away from people farm up on a mountaintop, and we did farm it, and we grew some very, very good food there, and we made it work in some ways. Partially, it can now be admitted because being isolated was beneficial in terms of our main cash crop, which they were looking for with helicopters, but our vegetables enabled us to intercrop in a way that we never actually, the helicopters never landed. So that can now be discussed more openly than it once could. The statute from limitations has run. But over time realized that, and I left that farm and went to another state to be in the flow of things, because we had a thing that was working, and we were growing a lot of things, and we had a broad crop range, and we were evolving away from the part of what had helped us capitalize that was illegal and therefore unsustainable. And we were really starting to make it with the legal and sustainable part. But we were on top of a mountain, and I had a yen for more impact on the larger cultural emergency, which is always a scary motivation. And so that led me to the siren song of bigger, and going to a place where there was a lot more tillage and a lot more people and a lot more compostable opportunity. And that was a several-year run that blew us back to Vermont, because we weren't loving the political environment we were functioning in, and we were pregnant, and we went back to Vermont and took a look around and said, all right, what do we do now? So we moved from a very rural mountaintop to a farm on Main Street in the capital city. And others have said, well, that was dumb from a regulatory point of view, and that may be the case. It gave us the combination of impact and enabled us. It makes the food we feed our chickens is a resource that we can actually go out with a team of animals and gather that. And we actually started moving food in town with a team of mules and a wagon. We quickly degenerated to trucks because we really didn't have I was the only teamster in our situation. But we still have ambition to put the animals to work moving food to the farm from the community. And though we did, current events in the farm is that we now have a box truck with a lift gate, and we're hauling food again, because the market for food has gotten roily, and we lost our local food supply to a fairly big industrial solution, a depack machine, which enables big generators like supermarkets to combine their plastic and throw it in the can, and it goes to a $600,000 machine in Maine that separates. Though we have some serious questions about the long-term sustainability of sending all our food to Maine, or the desirability of doing that, and also the sustainability of this machine, not the least of which is how much plastic ends up in the, we know what comes out, and that has to go to incineration because it can't be recycled, but also how much finely divided or microscopic plastic is going onto the fields. And I have had that, I've been whining about the biological significance of finely divided plastic in food soils. I've been whining for 40 years or more about it. Now there's a fairly broad understanding of a couple things. One is that finely divided plastics are in the sea, they're on the land, and they're in the sky. And that ship has somewhat sailed, but I still think it's worth resisting increasing the loading, because the volume of plastic in soil, since the plastic is not bioaccessible, or at least not yet, well, that's going to change too. We are aware now that in mangrove swamps, there are ecologies that are literally utilizing the carbon in polyethylene films over a 5-year time frame. Whereas as recently as 2000, a plastics engineering handbook would tell you that polyethylene is probably good for, and they used to say 400 to 500 years. Where they got that number, of course, is the same place that a lot of numbers come from, which is a bunch of people with credentials to guess something like that, guess it, and write it down, and it's in a book. And we hope, I have a deep optimistic faith in microbial rescue. I think microbial communities are adapting constantly, and they're not listening to words much. We used to have a joke, well, you can fool people not that hard. Say a bunch of things, use some words they may or may not understand. They might accept what you're saying. Plants, a little harder. They're not necessarily listening to what you're saying. Our job as greenhouse growers is often to give plants the satisfaction of thinking they're getting what they need, but maybe not giving it to them the way they're used to it. You plant a seed in the ground, it can forage over a broad range of space. You put a whole media in a cell, you've now really gone many orders of magnitude less world for that plant. We can do that. So we are in the business of tricking plants into get basil. Basil doesn't like rumor of winter, so we put it in a warm spot, and we don't let it look out the window, and we give it soil, and we heat that soil to support the microbial community that basil plant partners with. Microbes are really hard to fool. You keep calling it hardwood bark, but it's really turned into a pine bowl chip. Microbes are not utilizing it like hardwood bark anymore. The CN ratio has changed enormously. All the enzymes have changed. The fungal communities that are native to it, because wood carries spores. A lot of mycorrhizal traffic mycorrhizal spores are in the bark. Mycorrhizal involvement in a plant, it goes all the way from the apical tip to the root radical. It's throughout the plant. And mycorrhizal services include the transport of amino acids directly across the chloroplast. So that is in defiance of the agronomic textbooks of my training, which said the only ways that a plant can get nitrogen is as ammonium or nitrate. And that turns out to be absolutely untrue, which explains a lot of plant phenomena we've observed over time. Plants routinely, with microbial assistance, take amino acids from soil and move them across the chloroplast into the leaf. And that is the future of understanding how to support optimized photosynthesis, which every farmer's job is optimizing photosynthesis. And that is how we will recarbonize the 8 billion hectares of land that we humans have decarbonized over the last 8 to 10,000 years.
Unfortunately, I have to wrap up because I've got a next podcast interview right after this. But Karl, thank you so much for your time today. I mean, we could have gone on for 3 hours, literally. And
well, and if at some point you want to direct more focus on practice or on plant work or whatever, let's do it.
Absolutely. When is do you have any idea when your compost class may be coming out?
My compost class.
I know
Sorry, did I make it sound like I was about to do a compost class?
Well, at some point you may have said that you thought about offering some sort of training.
Well, we are thinking about what business model, what a business model might look like to kind of provide the guidance and feedback. So we know it would include doing lab work for clients or partners in other places. It would include perhaps setting our Main Street facility up as Compost University. It might include, so this is we're talking about a larger business plan. Right now, our business grew sales of over 17% growth year on year.
Wow.
Which, we always have to make the stuff and make sure it works. And we also dance with the ones that brung us. So we take new customers after we make sure we satisfy old customers.
Yeah.
Because we respect the loyalty, and we respect that over time these customers have learned to profit by using our stuff. So we're pushing the walls. We're pretty. Of my 20 people, there's nobody except me full-time thinking about where we might be going.
Yeah.
And even I do a lot of other things too. But we know that we aspire to evolve our business to be good soil citizens, which means that every region will have competence at this important craft. And how could we develop a business model that pays us to do that?
Gotcha.
As we evolve the pear orchard and vineyard that our farm we intend to evolve it into.
Absolutely.
Because one of the things and this informs our process. So we don't pour concrete. We operate on, we're constantly adding soil appropriate materials that we make compost upon, with the intention and expectation that when the need diminishes or disappears for compost making, we will have fantastic photosynthetic opportunity in all those work surfaces. And this is one of my objections to certain kinds of engineered facilities, and also to rules that require paving, which many rules do. And we need to look at the long term. And we have in our history many situations where we turned a compost project in the place where the need diminished. Ben & Jerry's closes a factory in Springfield, Vermont, and we turn the nearby compost project into a hayfield. That's
Absolutely.
a much better hayfield than it would have been before we had the compost period.
Yeah. Karl, where can people find more about you? Just VermontCompost.com?
VermontCompost.com. I wish it was a better place than it is. We are currently, for a change, trying to improve the website. Right now it's spring, so but we look for improvement there. And there are various podcasts and videos out and about, but we do have some video on the website that we think is helpful and useful. There is a reading list, I believe, and like that.
All right. And we will point people, we'll do show notes where we'll include some of those videos and stuff so people can find out more information.
Yeah. And thanks for giving me the opportunity to talk with you today.
Oh, absolutely. Always a pleasure. Anytime.
All right. See you, Michael.
Bye.
Bye.
All right, guys, so that's the end of the official interview with Karl. But Karl and I, when I got on the phone with him, he was sharing such great information right at the beginning before we started the official interview. I wanted to add that here so you can listen to that as well. Enjoy.
I'm just at a meeting on a chicken farm just leaving a joint House and Senate Ag Committee meeting with the poultry farmers for compost foraging to try to get some legislation to support the practice of feeding food to chickens.
Okay.
Yeah, anyway.
All right. Very cool. Because I know that was a struggle that you guys were like kind of arguing or fighting with them on if that was actually legal.
It's been a conversation that for over 20 years now. We started the practice of feeding community food to laying hens in '98. We've produced eggs for sale every day of every year since 1998 without buying grain for the birds, which to me would seem to be the big news about the whole thing, rather than an ongoing. It keeps resurfacing the question about whether this is a farming practice.
Yeah.
And we thought we had really settled it in about 2006 when both the Agency of Agriculture and the Agency of Natural Resources issued separate written decisions. The Agriculture Department saying that it is a farming practice, and the Solid Waste Division of the Agency of Natural Resources saying that if food is separated from solid waste with the intention to feed it to animals, that it has not been discarded, and that therefore they did not have jurisdiction. And the practice over time expanded around the state a bit to where about 9 or 10 farms were producing eggs by feeding chickens and composting the residuals. And in the last 5 years, there have been about 15 complaints from about 5 individuals about things like crows or odor or those things. So it hasn't caused a significant amount of trouble, but for whatever reason, the agencies kind of got together lately, last year, and decided that the feeding of food to chickens was not a farming practice, but a solid waste practice, and that to continue the practice, practitioners would need to get solid waste permitting.
Oh boy.
Now, in a lot of cases, and not so much in our case at Vermont Compost, for reasons I can get into, I think we can get a permit for the practice. But in a lot of towns, a solid waste permit would not be an allowed use in the ag district.
Yeah.
So that triggers all kinds of regulatory challenges, potentially, that with quite a substantial cost burden, making the process, which is already, producing eggs for sale, is hard work and doesn't pay very well. Even if in many confinement operations, 70% of the cost is the grain or the feed. We take away that cost, but we add labor. And so we've, egg production is a karma yoga thing. You do it because eggs are food that people need, and that we all eat eggs, and we try to be as solvent as possible on egg production, but it's very hard to cover the reasonable wages for people doing the work and make money with global pricing of eggs at about $1.70 a dozen. So we always gave the tipping revenue from the accepting and managing food to the egg part of our the egg enterprise. So the chickens had the revenue from the tipping so that they could afford their cow manure, their horse manure, their hardwood bark, their spoiled crops, their person, their loader, and their house. And that, we get $4 for our eggs. We could sell a lot more eggs than we're currently producing. We actually are in the middle of this regulatory uncertainty, building a new chicken house and changing the way we get food. We've had to undertake the hauling again after many years, but
Hey, thriving farmers, and that is a wrap with Karl. Now, Karl, unfortunately, I had to go right after that interview to another interview, so I didn't have enough time. So we've kind of worked the process so we give them more time with the guest so that we don't have to get cut off tight like we did with Karl there. But we will have Karl on again. As if you have more questions, feel free to send them in to our team, and we'll make sure that we book him again on the podcast to talk about what you want to hear from Karl, all about building soil. So joining me on the podcast next week is Katrina McAlexander. So Katrina is a orchardist, and so she raises fruit in the Pacific Northwest. They have a winery, they have a cidery, they are doing on-farm events, they are doing school tours, they have an on-farm restaurant. So she has really done a fabulous job building out her farm to support her community, and it tells. So it's a fabulous interview, a lot of heart she shares about why she does what she does, why she set the farm up the way she does, and she actually still works 1 day a week off farm. So we go into that and why she does that and how that entire operation is set up. So join me next week for this fascinating interview. So there you have it, another episode in the books. So I'd love if you would hop on over to iTunes and leave us a rating and a review. Those mean everything to us. We love to hear what you're thinking. If you have a podcast guest that you can recommend, please pop on over to the Thriving Farmer Podcast website and leave us a review. That's thrivingfarmerpodcast.com.